All right, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for our first Livable Future Live event of the new year. My name is Kate Schwanhauser and I'll be kicking things off this evening before I pass things over to our Executive Director, Winona Howder. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion this evening with Nathaniel Rich, who is the author of the book, Losing Earth, A Recent History. And that's the reason why we are here tonight. We're hosting this discussion because Winona chose Losing Earth as her 2022 Book of the Year selection. As an environmental activist herself from the 1970s, she witnessed firsthand the decade described in Losing Earth. And she picked out this book because it tells the little known but fascinating story of what happened in the decade where the climate crisis could have been averted. And we're just so glad that Nathaniel is able to join us this evening for a conversation about it. But before we get to that, I'll give people just another minute or so to get logged in. And in the meantime, I'll just go over a quick few housekeeping reminders and share some upcoming event announcements. So while I'm doing that, please go ahead and take a moment and share your name in the chat and where you're joining us from today so we can get to know you a little better. All right, so just a few Zoom reminders for you all. So first, if you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, go ahead and click on the closed caption button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. And if you don't see it, feel free to click on the three dots that say more, and that will open up the full menu for you there. And please feel free to use the chat during the event as a space to share your thoughts and reactions as you're listening to tonight's conversation. And we do also have a chat moderator this evening. Her name is Kia. So she'll be sharing a few links with you all, and all of her messages will have a blue dot at the beginning, so they'll be easier to find in that chat thread. And we are excited that we'll have some time for Q&A with Nathaniel at the end. So if you have questions for him, the best place for those is in the Q&A box so that I can keep track of those as they come in. And finally, we are recording tonight's event, so I'll be sharing the link out to that recording later this week with everyone who's RSVP'd. And we do also have some folks who are joining us on Facebook live stream, so hello and welcome to you all as well. Please feel free to use the comments on Facebook as a place to share your thoughts and reactions as you're listening along with us. So for those of you who might be new to Food and Water Watch, tonight's event is part of our Livable Future Live monthly virtual event series. So every month we meet here and we cover a different environmental topic, and we've got a great lineup ahead of us. So next month on February 15th, we'll be talking about carbon capture and storage, or CCS, which is the fossil fuel industry's latest greenwashing scam. We know this technology is not only expensive and dangerous to communities living nearby, but it's ineffective. So we'll be talking more about our national campaign and local efforts in Iowa, which is a key battleground state facing multiple carbon pipeline proposals. Then in March, please join us for World Water Day on March 22nd. It's been nearly 13 years since water was declared a basic human right, but we still have a long way to go to ensure water justice for all. So we'll share how we can fight to stop water privatization and stop corporate misuse of public water resources so that we can ensure that everyone has access to clean and affordable water. So I encourage you to join us for those to learn more about these issues and the ways that you can get involved. Kia will put a link in the chat for you where you can sign up for those, and I hope we'll see you there. All right, so today we are talking about Losing Earth, which covers the 10-year period from 1979 to 1989, as a group of scientists, activists, and politicians began raising the alarm about the causes and dangers of climate change, and unfortunately why we failed to take decisive action. Losing Earth adds a human story behind this period of our history and gives us insights into the motivations and lives of many of the key people involved in this effort. So it's a really interesting and important book about how we got to where we are today. And many of you may have already read this book, but if not, you're in luck. We do have a few copies that we will be sending to 3 lucky viewers today. So you can enter your name into our virtual drawing by clicking on the link that we'll put in the chat. So just be sure to fill that out by the end of the event today. And I'll be reaching out to our winners later this week. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it. So tonight, as I said, we are so excited to have Nathaniel Rich here with us to tell us more about his book this evening. Many of you might know this story was initially told in the New York Times Magazine, which devoted an entire issue to the subject. And Nathaniel then expanded it into the book. And it was a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Award and winner of awards from the Society of Environmental Journalists and the American Institute of Physics. And in addition to Losing Earth, he's also the author of Second Nature, which features the story Dark Waters and was adapted into a film starring Mark Ruffalo. Nathaniel's also the author of novels King Zeno and Odds Against Tomorrow, and he is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine, a frequent contributor to The Atlantic and the New York Review of Books. He will be joining us from New Orleans tonight, where he is a teacher at Tulane. So welcome, Nathaniel. We are glad to have you here this evening. And I will also invite Winona to join us on our virtual stage here. She is the founder and executive director of Food and Water Watch, and she founded Food and Water Watch in 2005. And one of the main reasons was that she witnessed this period of our history that's described in the book. And she saw that there was a lot of political power that a much needed grassroots movement like ours could bring to stopping the fossil fuel industry and their allies. So here we are, and she has 3 decades of experience campaigning and writing on food, water, energy, and environmental issues, and is the author of the books Frackopoly and Foodopoly. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Winona and Nathaniel. Thank you both so much.
Thanks so much, Kate. And Nathaniel, I have really been looking forward to this evening. I so much enjoyed Losing Earth. It was a poignant experience, but a real page turner too. So can you talk just a little bit about how you ended up expanding the New York Times article into a book and what got you interested in the subject?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, to Kate for that kind introduction, and Winona for choosing Losing Earth. And for all of you out there to come out, it's really heartwarming that in this sort of post Zoom fatigue era, I guess, that so many people want to be part of this conversation and talk about these issues. So to answer your question, I mean, I'll try to do it as concisely as possible, but the story began as a joint partnership between the Times Magazine and the Pulitzer Center, a great journalistic institute. And the idea was to publish an entire issue-length article in the New York Times Magazine about climate change. And they asked me if I had any ideas. And so I began to think very seriously. It was a tremendous amount of responsibility to try to figure out, what story should be told in that kind of venue. Going up to that point, I had been writing about environmental issues. I'd been writing about climate, largely driven out of a frustration with what I was reading and the kind of writing that was being devoted to climate change. I felt there was a lot of good science journalism about climate change, about what was happening in the atmosphere, what the ramifications might be. I thought there was pretty good political reporting about, what was going on in Washington and Congress and all of that. But I felt like there was something cold about the whole subject. And as far as I'm concerned, it is the defining story of our age and of our future. And I felt like if I was going to write about this, I wanted to write from a more human perspective and an intimate perspective. And so that was the beginning of the conversations that I had with my editors. And finally, we narrowed in on this story about this period of time that had been basically forgotten. I mean, I'm sure not by you and many of the people in the Zoom chat, but this period during the 80s when the science was clear, there were real solutions being proposed and debated at the highest levels of government, both in the US and globally. And there was, most crucially, not this strong political divide that has just ossified and doomed the political process for more than 30 years now. So it was this time of possibility, and I wanted to talk about the story during that time and try to understand, why we didn't succeed then, and try to understand even more crucially the stories of the people. Is really a small group of people in Washington, largely, who dedicated their lives to essentially telling the world and warning the world about this problem and trying to do something before it was too late. And so as much as it's the policy story of the period, the political story of the period, it's also the human story of a few individuals whose lives were completely transformed by their involvement in this issue, and furthermore, were forced to confront some larger questions about humanity and the future of this whole civilization project in very intimate, personal ways, and in ways that I think only now the greater public is beginning to ask ourselves. And so I spent a year researching it. Or more really. I think I'd intended to spend a year researching it. It ended up taking closer to 2, I think. I interviewed more than 100 people from, administration officials from various White Houses, activists, scientists, staffers, you name it, and ultimately published this story. It took on this sort of insane life of its own globally, and it's now been published all over the world. And I think what's I expanded into a book, and I felt like I wanted to tell the most full version of it. I had 30,000 words in the magazine, so it's not nothing. The book isn't that much longer, but I wanted to just fill out the story. I felt like I had one more shot at it to do it exactly right and do the complete authoritative version. And so that's what you now have before you. And it's but it's what's the most thrilling thing about it for me is to continue to have this conversation, because this is a conversation that's not really about a historical period that's gone. It's really a conversation about where we are now and where we're going.
Well, one of the questions I had in reading the book was whether you knew Rafe Pomerantz or any of the other main characters, or whether that was his name was something you came upon in doing your research.
Yeah, well, when I started writing about the period, I knew it was going to begin in 1979, when you have really the scientific consensus forms. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about why we can say that. And I knew we wanted to end in 1989, which is right when the oil and gas industry sort of sinks its teeth in, develops a concerted, I would characterize it as a criminal conspiracy to stop any kind of climate policy that is still with us. Basically, the origin of denial, full-fledged denialism, and the beginning of the partisan nature of the debate. And so I had this period. I knew a few, obvious major turning points, and I was looking for figures who were present basically at different major points in the decade, because it was very crucial to me to tell it through the stories of individuals. And so I knew I needed some characters, basically. James Hansen was an obvious one. Al Gore was a pretty obvious one, in that he started working on this issue as a junior congressman in 1980. But I still didn't quite have it until I came across this name of Rafe Pomerantz, who is a guy who very purposefully was behind the scenes during this decade. And yet, as I gradually realized, and it took a while to put this together in a lot of interviews of people kept saying, you should talk to Rafe, you should talk to Rafe. He was not just sort of present at every stop along the way, every congressional hearing and important symposium and political meeting, but he was really guiding the process from behind the scenes. And the only reason no one didn't know about him outside of this very small group of people in Washington, policy circles and climate circles, was that was his whole intention. He wanted to be behind the scenes. He felt that he could be more effective behind the scenes, guiding the action. And so I met him in one of my first visits to Washington, and it turns out he's this extremely charismatic, charming, figure, and was more than happy after all these years to finally tell his version of the story. So that was the one true piece of journalistic serendipity, that I just happened to come across the story and his role in it at exactly the right time when he was finally willing to talk. And that helped guide the project, and he became really the main figure in the story. And you know, he's present through the chronology, but he also went through a very dramatic emotional reckoning through the period that becomes the real core of the narrative. He you know, his life was thrown upside down, and he had some major emotional damage from these battles that he fought during this decade. And you know, one of the first things he told me was when he first discovered global warming, when he first read about it in this obscure government report at his desk at an environmental organization in 1979, he thought immediately of his wife, and who was pregnant. So I think 4 months pregnant at the time, and once he started to realize the scale of the problem and the ramifications, he began to ask himself, you know, is this responsible, essentially, to bring a child into this world knowing what we know? And you know, to this day, this is the question that I get more than any other one now from young people, typically, when I go around talking about losing Earth, is, you know, knowing what we know is, you know, they're having the same kind of debate. And it raises a lot of moral questions and ethical questions. And I think for me, that's kind of the tip of the spear of a deeper human, personal engagement with the scope of what we're up against.
Yes, so true. You know, I worked at the Union of Concerned Scientists at the very end of the 1980s, I think starting about 1988. One of the groups that you mentioned, having been involved in climate change. And one of the things that stands out to me as I think about that period now is how reluctant the leadership of UCS, but a lot of the major environmental groups were to really talk about climate change, which of course was called global warming more often than, to really talk about it as happening then. Even though Dr. Hansen had testified in Congress that it was 99% certain that the warming trend was not a natural variation, but a buildup of carbon dioxide. I wondered, as you did the research, did you gain any insight to why there was so much reluctance, even by the end of the 1980s, to talk about it as something happening then?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that I struggled with. And to understand, to get to the answer, you sort of have to take a step back and understand sort of the culture of not just the political culture at the time, but the culture within the scientific community and within the environmental activism community. When Rafe Pomerantz became interested in 1979 in this issue, he was working at Friends of the Earth, which is David Brower founded after Sierra Club, and there was a very specific model about how these groups, which kickstarted the environmental movement in the 70s and came of age with it, how they tackled environmental problems and the kind of problems they tackled. They tended to, and how they raised money also, crucially. They tended to focus on places of extreme environmental degradation, usually a location where they could sort of show people who the heroes were, who villains were, and there was a very legible solution. Clean up the river. Turn this into Superfund site, and so on. And climate change didn't fit the bill. So it was very confusing. It's hard to imagine now, I think, given its role in environmental politics, environmental activism today. But for much of the 80s, there were not many environmental activists and activist organizations who took on the issue. You can find stray mentions of, I kept getting frustrated, like, why isn't the Sierra Club, why can't I not find nothing about climate change in the Sierra Club newsletter and NRDC, all of these vaunted organizations who are doing critical and important work during this time. And I spoke to Rafe about it, and he said, basically, for most of the decade, it was basically him. It took a while for the activist community to understand, just as it did for the political community and for the rest of the world, to understand, well, how do we talk about a global environmental problem? How do we talk about a problem that's long-term, that's incremental, where even in the best case scenario, we won't avoid total, some major problems, and where there's not just like a spigot you can turn off. So that was part of it. The other, within the scientific community, and this is James Hansen's story that he kept running against beginning in 1980 when he started publishing major studies about coal and CO2, was that there was an extreme reluctance to talk about policy, to essentially to move from the scientific sphere to the political sphere. So when Hansen, in I think it was 1980, in a study about CO2 and coal, said at the end of the paper, well, there's a remedy for this problem, more or less, which is essentially like, yes, we should stop burning coal. This is a major contributor to climate. That, and it was on the front page of the New York Times, 1980, I believe. And that was created a crisis for him professionally and personally. And that kind of gave him a stigma within his community and at NASA that he had to fight really hard to against. And that reaches a kind of crescendo at the end of the decade, when in his famous testimony before Congress in 1988, when he says, global warming is not a theory anymore, it's here now. You can find the evidence in the temperature record. A lot of blowback even then from scientists. On one hand, there was some scientific criticism, essentially saying, well, your numbers aren't right. But there was also a kind of cultural criticism, which was the subtext of which was, how dare you get involved in policy sphere? That's, where scientists were above that. So it took a while for these, and there still is conflict within the scientific community about this, although I think it's changed quite dramatically. And so it took a while for these institutions and for the politics to adjust to the nature of the problem, even though it should be said the problem had been around for much longer than, so the scientists were aware of the problem for many decades, even before the 1979.
One of the things that really interested me in the book was your description of William Nordhaus. He'd been a member of Carter's Council of Economic Advisors, and he was concerned that there wasn't a monetary value for the damage climate change was doing. And so he developed a new economic model. And he proposed having the market solve the problem by having nations pay the true cost of carbon by levying a tax, a global carbon tax. In retrospect, did any of the people that you interviewed see this idea of the market as a solution rather than arguing for a phase out of combusting fossil fuels as a policy failure?
Yeah, it's fascinating to read those papers. I mean, Nordhaus is publishing papers about this subject in I think as early as 1972, if I remember correctly. And there's a whole group of people who worked under him, who were one of whom I interviewed at great length, Jesse Ossibel, on essentially, yes, on trying to solve it through the market and get, giving carbon a cost. And what's striking reading those papers, and then there's a sort of similar band of study within political science and sociology at the time, where people are saying, well, could this work? more like, could Nordhaus's plan work? You know, they had symposiums and, you know, this wasn't sort of secret and arcane exactly. This was all out in the open, and it's really startling to go back and read these you know, transcripts of conversations that were being held in the late 1970s, where they're essentially debating these points exactly. And, you know, down to the intricacies of, you know, right now the United States is the leading cause of emissions and is responsible for the lion's share of emissions, but by the 1990s or shortly thereafter, China and other countries in the developing world will overtake us, and we might lose the ability and the power and essentially the moral claim to tell other countries by then to stop, you know, burning fuels because we've done it. You know, so we're seeing that play out now in real time. So I think there was, I mean, if your question is, was there skepticism? Absolutely, yeah. And there was a heated debate about this. And there was political scientists who said that there's no world in which you could sign a treaty that would be binding, that would essentially force countries to enforce a carbon tax. And that side has sort of won the day in reality, but it's still, Nordhaus is a complicated figure because he's also been used at different points in his career by different players on either side. I mean, his work was very, you know, I was told by people who were in the first Bush's administration in the Economic Council, they were circulating Nordhaus's papers and invited him to speak to the Economic Council. So his work has been also used on the right to justify not taking action, and then it's been used for the opposite, you know, and so it's but yes, that whole lane, that whole approach has largely been abandoned unless you read the sort of flip side of it, which is to say, like the using the carrot approach rather than the stick of that you've seen in the Biden administration most recently of giving huge subsidies to renewable energy in the hope that essentially you'll build the market up on the other side rather than reduce, you know, penalize the market on the front side.
I remember the first time I heard about it years ago, the carbon tax. And what struck me is it's always hard to organize and advocate for a tax. And it wasn't even ideological on my part at that point. It was just, I think this is going to be really hard. But
yeah, and I think Nordhaus acknowledges that, but also felt that no alternative was close to as effective or had the promise of the tax. So he was, you know, he clung to it.
Well, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Jasons. Not everybody may be familiar with them, and I think they are just fascinating, and I'm going to read the book that you referenced.
Yes, there's an excellent book about them by a really wonderful writer on science and science history named Anne Finkbinder. The Jasons were this, I guess, they still exist in some form. They were extremely top secret group of scientists, basically the elite science, you know, the top 20 scientists in the country, more or less, as seen by the government, who were convened every year in secrecy to solve matters of challenges of national security import. And so this is the whole thinking behind this really comes out and to understand the Jasons, I think, fully, you have to understand the role that scientists played in the Cold War, you know, coming out of the Manhattan Project. And they had a position of enormous political influence that today it's almost laughable to think that scientists could have that level of influence, certainly in the last administration, but even within, you know, the current administration. They were like these sort of philosopher kings within each administration. And during the Vietnam War, they were tasked with inventing, you know, new kinds of weaponry and new kinds of battle strategies to unleash. And it was only in the Pentagon Papers that the existence of the Jasons was publicized and became a huge scandal. But some of the projects that they worked on weren't quite so incendiary. There was also an effort by Gordon MacDonald, who was really one of the senior scientists within the intelligence community, to try to take on global warming. And he became very alarmed about it. He was an advisor in the Nixon administration. He was an advisor under Kennedy, and then in Carter. And he started to become very concerned about climate change and the destabilization that it would cause on the global stage. And he began writing papers about it and holding conferences about it within the Jasons and then more publicly. And it was when Rafe Pomerantz read in a newspaper a sort of brief account of one of these talks that gave him the idea to join forces with MacDonald. And so the story of this decade begins when Pomerantz, this sort of anti-war activist and environmental activist with big bushy hair, young guy, joins up with a senior member of the military-industrial complex, Gordon MacDonald, former football player, kind of former prodigy, military expert. And they go together, they join forces, and they go around Capitol Hill to try to warn the senior-most members of the Carter administration about the perils of global warming. And that kickstarts essentially the Washington's involvement in this problem.
You know, you write a lot about the bipartisan support for doing something on climate change. Do you see it, based on your research, as more of a gradual loss of support in the 80s, towards the end of the 80s? Or were there some dramatic moments when it became divisive, maybe not as divisive as it is today, but the bipartisan support had melted away?
Yeah, so you have the short version is you have an enormous amount of energy at the end of the Carter administration, although energy is not the same as actual policy, but there's a lot of activity within the Carter administration that bleeds into the early days of the Reagan administration. But then Reagan's onslaught against environmental regulations, environmental movement back on their heels, and they had to protect the gains they'd made not only in the Carter administration but really over several decades in terms of environmental protection. And so climate change was abandoned basically as a major ticket issue. And a major report in 1983 that was published within the administration also put a huge damper on it. And I go into that story in Losing Earth. It's not until 86, 87 that it reemerges, and it reemerges by piggybacking essentially on the ozone hole concern. And the ozone hole does something for the climate change narrative, which is that it presents the prospect of a solution. And the solution is seen as a global treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, modeled after the Montreal Protocol, which was the successful treaty and the first global environmental treaty of its kind. And Rafe Pomerantz and a bunch of other people in climate policy circles seize on that. And what's fascinating is 86, 87, when you have this bipartisan effort, within the Reagan administration backing the Montreal Protocol, after some belly aching, but they come around finally. And when they sign the protocol, the head of Reagan's EPA is asked at the press conference, "What about climate?" And he said, "Yes, that's the next step for us. We're going to do, a Montreal Protocol for climate change." So that's under Reagan. What happens is in 1988, Hansen testifies, public awareness of the issue mushrooms, and the oil and gas industry starts for the first time to get worried about the politics and the bottom line for their industry. And so that's where you see start to tilt. And I write extensively about, where the oil and gas industry was before then. It's not, certainly they were not in a virtuous position before then, but there you start to see them tighten the screws and invest effort and money into stopping policy. And so that's the beginning of when it starts to crumble. And what I found, one of the most shocking things I found in my research were these two white papers, one at Exxon, the biggest oil and gas company in the world, and one at the American Petroleum Institute, which was the largest trade group in the world that Exxon is the major member of. And both papers are published at the end of '88, early '89, and they come to the same conclusions, which are essentially that we need to formulate a strategy to deal with this. It appears that climate policy is coming down the pike, and we're going to have to confront it. For the first time, there's 32 bills filed in Congress, including a couple omnibus bills, one by a Republican House member, one by a Democrat in the Senate, that were more ambitious than what has been called the Green New Deal. Extremely ambitious legislation is introduced, and you have the Bush administration talking about taking on the problem as soon as they're in office. Bush runs on it. And so the industry gets scared, and that's when the politics start to turn. I tell the story of how the sort of earliest iteration of the IPCC process falls apart in 1989, which is the result of some very dramatic internal politics within the Bush White House. But shortly after that, you start to see industry essentially sinking its teeth in, and that's when the politics start shifting very quickly after that.
One of the things I'm struck by is how different activists are today, the younger activists, than from previous generations. How do you think the climate movement has changed and adapted?
Well, an enormous shift took place in 2018, which was after I published the magazine version. And essentially the activist line from starting in 1979 and really going through 2018 was an appeal to rationality and an appeal to reason, essentially, which was to say, we know the science, we know what will happen if we fail to act. We know how we need to act. We need to basically reduce emissions as quickly as possible. We know the mechanisms through which we can do that, and so on. And if we don't act, things are going to get bad. And it's essentially, you see that argument in an increasingly high pitch over the course of those decades. And you get Al Gore saying, not only do we have this information, here are some new graphs, and we have a moral responsibility to act, or we'd be crazy not to act. But it's only in the midterms in 2018 where you start to see the growth of a major popular movement led by young people who, of course acknowledge the appeal to reason. So yes, of course we should act. Of course this is real. But that's not the core of the messaging. The core of the messaging instead is a sense that we've been betrayed, that failure to act is morally reprehensible. It's dooming us to disaster, dooming our children, our lives, to deep personal disaster. This is not abstract. We're talking about our futures. We've been given a raw bill of goods. We've been lied to, and so on. And that kind of activism is much more personal. It's more emotional, I think, and it's more honest. And it's in a moral framework. It's not just that it's stupid to act. It's that it's wrong to act, and it's criminal not to act. And that to me is the biggest shift in the politics in this history. And with it comes an understanding of the cruelty of climate change, which is to say, it's not just that it's going to be bad for everyone. Yes, and to some degree it'll be bad for everybody, but that the cruelty of climate change is such that it affects, it exacerbates almost every form of inequality in our society. So the people who are already most ostracized, most oppressed, whether because of race or income level or geography, are the ones who are most, will suffer the most and have already begun to suffer the most because of climate change. That if you care about any form of inequality in our society, you have to care about climate change because it's the stressor on every single one of them, just about. And so that moral framework, I trace the history of that way of thinking back. I mean, you see it beginning in the 80s in the context of climate specifically, but it's not given voice on a massive public level until that period of sit-ins in Nancy Pelosi's office. You have Sunrise Movement and Greta Thunberg and this whole youth movement around the world that picks up this mantle, and that's really shifted the dialogue. Not just on the left, but I think it's also shifted it on the right, which is not to say it's overcome all of the challenges, but it has precipitated, I think, a fairly dramatic transition that we're now having.
Have you thought about writing a follow-up book to Losing Earth?
Well, I mean, Second Nature, which I published last year, is a collection of, it's sort of a different form. It's a collection of stories, nonfiction reported stories, but I see that as a kind of sequel. I mean, it's not part two, or it's not, the present to the future exactly, but it's about what happens after you open your eyes and understand that the world of the future will not resemble anything we've known in the past. And so it's stories about people who are trying to navigate the weirdness of and the terror of, but also the possibility of this age that we're now entering. And so it's stories about people grappling with the full scale of environmental pollution, like you see in Dark Waters, but it's also stories about new forms of technology, the moral implications of using technology and genetic engineering and essentially forms of terraforming to try to right the wrongs of the past. And they're, it's stories told in a similar fashion in that they're intimate human stories about people who have found some aspect of their lives completely transformed by the awareness of what's happening and what has happened and what's going to be happening, and try to navigate through it, often without full clarity on what is the right approach. And so those are stories that I feel like will increasingly dominate, I think, our future, where we've entered a place where there's not a silver bullet, where any situation is not ideal, but we're trying to muddle through and figure out a way to preserve what makes us human in a world that is increasingly unrecognizable from anything human beings have encountered in our history.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on a related note, you mentioned Dark Waters. How did you get involved in covering that story?
Yeah, this is a really crazy story about how DuPont has poisoned all of us and every living creature on the planet with these forever chemicals. In fact, I live in New Orleans. They just discovered that the water in the Mississippi, I'm sure many people on this call know this, is unsurprisingly heavily tainted with these chemicals produced by DuPont and 3M for decades, with the full knowledge that they had enormous health risks. They lied about it, covered it up, and tried to dodge any kind of legal culpability until this lawyer came along named Robert Bilott, who was an insider, a defense lawyer, from Ohio, from Cincinnati, whose job was to defend chemical corporations. And it was through his grandmother, essentially, he learned about this case of these cattle farmers whose cows were dying. And they were convinced that it was because they were drinking water from a DuPont factory in West Virginia next to their land. And he didn't believe it, but he investigated it. And thus began this 30-year saga now in which the scale of the pollution has grown from a few cows to a few cities to the world. And it's a really dramatic story, and it came to me, to answer your question finally, came to me in the most bizarre way, in that I got an email over the transom from a lawyer, basically a junior lawyer on Balat's team, and it's the kind of thing I normally just throw right in the trash, but he had all these attachments. He said something, this is the biggest criminal conspiracy, corporate criminals conspiracy of the century. Like, I was like, whatever, what could this possibly be? They sent these transcripts that were of interviews, depositions taken with DuPont executives that they were going to use in trial, that were so shocking and crazy that I obviously it got my attention, and I soon learned that Balat, sort of like Pomerantz, had been devoting his life to this for decades, but had refused to really go to the press, worrying that it might jeopardize the legal case. But he agreed for the first time to speak with me and tell his story, and that's the story I wrote in Dark Waters, and it's truly chilling and frightening, and it's another, and it matches the climate story in many ways. Corporate villainy at the highest level that affects all of us. We all have PFOA in our blood. And so, it was a bizarre, it's a very dramatic and incredible story. And it came to me in the most bizarre way possible. But I'm grateful that they came to me with it.
Well, there are definitely a lot of parallels with Losing Earth. Well, I can't believe it, but it's time for audience questions.
All right, awesome. This has been great. We are getting some really great comments and thoughts in the chat. Tons of questions for you, Nathaniel. So we'll try to get through.
Bring them on. Yeah, I'll try to do them as quickly as possible. Yeah, thank you all for chiming in.
All right, so let's take the first question. This is from Eric. He's asking, are there any lessons from this history that are relevant today, but maybe underappreciated or underutilized?
That is a really good question. I mean, there's some obvious lessons about the role of industry and politics. What's not as obvious, and I think that's especially hard often for activist groups to fully reckon with, is the degree of complexity and difficulty built into the political process in trying to get reforms done, even absent the sort of nefarious influence of industry in this case. And that's really what I was writing about. What does this look like in this world before industry is devoting its enormous resources to try to stop solutions? Well, you don't have to run an experiment. It's not a hypothetical. We had this period of time when that was the case. And yet it was still an enormous challenge. And so I think if there's something that's not fully appreciated, it's the extremely hard work that has to be done, certainly within our political system, to get politicians to act. It's not enough for politicians to agree with you. It's not enough if everyone was a Democrat and ran on climate policy, it would still be difficult. And that's what I wanted to write about. It's of course it's possible, but there are enormous challenges that need to be addressed with great attention and persistence. Essentially, an issue this big, it's not enough for people to agree on it. It has to be the top priority. There's a big distinction between agreement, which now at least most of one party agrees that we should act, and then saying, no, this has to be the top priority. This is ahead of healthcare. This is ahead of military questions. This is because for a period of time, the way our Congress works, it needs to take action as if it is. And so I think that would be my answer of what's underappreciated. And of course, the other part of that calculation is how do you get a plurality of citizens to also vote and tell their politicians that this is not only something we all agree with, this is something that we want you to do immediately. And that's hard work, but that's the work that activist organizations, I think, are now doing.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and a related question. This is from Mary Ellen Miller. How much today can you see public education and advocacy shifting the needle to policy change as a solution or one of the solutions?
Yeah, I think that's crucial. I think generational change is a big part of it also. I think there's a real, different way of engaging with this issue if you're 10 or 20 or versus 80 or not, going up, and it becomes increasingly personal, and it becomes, I think, the political divide is less entrenched. You also see that going from the national level to the local level. I live in southern Louisiana. This is a deep red state. Obviously, New Orleans is not, but the southern Louisiana, even if you take New Orleans out of it, there's not a lot of climate denial down here. These aren't denialists. These are people who have seen their marshes disintegrate in dramatic ways over the decades. So they're not denialists, but they're also, this is a petrochemical state. So you have these kind of two realities here that people struggle with, but it is instructive because the politics around these issues are very different than you might find, I don't know, in Wyoming, say. And one of the manifestations of is that we have in Louisiana, nobody talks about this, the world's most ambitious climate change mitigation infrastructure plan in the world. I've written a lot about it in Second Nature, but it's basically this 50-year plan, $50 billion plan that keeps renewing to rebuild the coast. They don't use the word climate change when they talk about it here, but they're doing it because they see what's happening and they know about sea level rise.
All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Somebody responded, you said that, this isn't the top priority, but it needs to be the top priority. And a few other people are asking, what do you think is the root cause of that? It seems to be, the greed of the powerful. So is this a symptom of deeper reform that needs to happen? Yeah,
that's certainly part of it. I think you have a basic problem with both the scope and the timescale of the issue. I think there was a lot of hope that every summer when there's these horrific, it sounds sort of perverse to speak about it in this way, but when you have these horrific droughts and wildfires, or where I live, hurricanes, there's this idea that, oh, now finally you'll see, now these people, people will see like this is real and now they should be worried. And there's a lot of hope pinned on, once people confront the disaster head on, the politics will shift. And I think there's something to that, but it's far overstated. I mean, this was going on, if you read headlines in the late 1980s, 1988 was the hottest summer on record. Of course, it's been beat 25 times since then, but all the headlines were about, is this climate change? There were huge droughts, wildfires, fires from Yellowstone could be seen in Chicago. And finally, this will get people to change their minds. And that basically, that news cycle repeats every year. And so I think that's not fully enough, that there has to be a appeal to, essentially there has to be a moral appeal that even if you're not, fire's not at your door, or you don't live in the most endangered city in the country, as I do, you still care that society is deeply threatened by this, and that you want to take, and you see a similar kind of transition happening during the civil rights era. You see it a bit around nuclear energy. You've seen it in other major social transitions, women's rights, suffrage, and all the rest, where a political claim, where something that begins maybe as an interest group or a small concern becomes a moral concern, and it becomes a national moral concern. And I think that's beginning to happen with climate. It has been happening, but we're not there yet. Education is part of it. Activism is part of it. And I think generational change is part of it as well.
We'll take one more question from Jean, and then I have a question. I'll do another combo question of a few. So, since your book was published, are you feeling more or less optimistic about the future, and why? And that's from Jean.
Yeah, the optimism question is really, I guess the short answer is neither more optimistic nor pessimistic. I think a lot of good things have happened especially in the last year or so. that have made me feel better. Some of the policies out of this administration, some of the technological advancements, some of the changes in the economics around renewable energy. I know it's something that your group studies closely. But I suppose I just reject this call to optimism. I'm really struck when I've spoken about losing Earth in other countries, especially in places like Europe or Northern Europe. There's no sense that you have to be particularly optimistic to engage with this, to take up arms in this issue. It's people in Northern Europe aren't very optimistic about it, and yet their policies are, for the most, generalized, are far more progressive on these issues, and the populace is far more engaged generally. And so I think it's a sort of American idea that there's fear that basically if people are worried, they will lose motivation to act. And so I guess I reject that premise a little bit, or I at least would want to challenge it a bit and say that, at any point in the timeline, there's a wide range of outcomes that are available to us. There's always a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. The best case scenario now is not as good as it was in 1989 or 1979. But that doesn't mean we should fight any less hard to try to achieve it, because the alternative is incomprehensible.
And so finally, we've gotten a lot of questions from people asking, what can we do? What can I do today to make a difference, to fight for our climate? So I'll actually pose this to both of you. Nathaniel, if you have any thoughts on where you see avenues of opportunity in the future, and then Winona, I'll pose the same question to you. What opportunities do you see for Food and Water Watch in the year ahead?
Yeah, I would simply, and I would certainly defer to Winona on these questions. I mean, I would simply say the more that we talk about it, the better. Certainly voting, this sort of old, effective, but maybe boring answers: voting, organizing, supporting activist groups that are engaged in the issue. And for me, most crucially, is to understand it not as a siloed issue, like one on the buffet of political issues that we're confronted with every election season, but to understand it as the interstitial, like the network, the background, the frame for basically every other major crisis facing us, that it connects all of these crises of inequality and even foreign policy and health outcomes and all the rest are all affected by climate. So to understand it as the larger context, I think is crucial for understanding the need to act and to act urgently.
So I agree. And I want to focus on our grassroots model at Food and Water Watch, because we have spent years building up powerful bases in communities across the country. So even though we have a Republican Congress, we can still fight in New York for expanding the gas ban, and we can fight pipelines. There are so many things that we can do to build the political power that we really need for long-term change. And that has to happen community by community. And that's what we're doing at Food and Water Watch. And we're really grateful for all of the support of our membership. And I want to urge everybody to become a Food and Water Watch partner. You can go to our website and find out more information about how to do that.
Awesome. All right, we are coming up on time here. So I just want to thank you again, Nathaniel, so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here, for all the work that you've done with Losing Earth and the way that you've used it as a platform to call attention to the urgency of the climate crisis. So thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming out, and thank you to the whole organization for the work that you do. That's really critically fighting these battles. So I'm grateful for you for having me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, Nathaniel.
All right, and I do just have a couple of quick reminders for everybody before I let you all go, including one about the book raffle. So, you know, as you heard from Winona, Food and Water Watch does have a long-term vision to build power in communities across the country so that we can continue to make a difference at the local, state, and national level. And Food and Water Watch is able to take really strong stances and always put people first because we don't take any corporate funding. So we aren't beholden to any special interests other than the health and well-being of our communities and our planet. And all of our support comes from people like you here tonight. So I encourage you to make a donation today to become a partner with Food and Water Watch. Whether that's a one-time gift or a monthly recurring donation, you are really helping us start the year off strong. And we do have a special matching gift opportunity. Today is actually the last day. It closes at midnight. But if you sign up today, all of your donations will be matched dollar for dollar through the rest of the year. So essentially doubling your impact for all of 2023. And again, that match ends tonight. So please consider signing up with us to fully fund our campaigns for the year ahead. And if you haven't yet, please make sure that you enter yourself into our raffle for a copy of Losing Earth. We have 3 copies that we're giving away. So be sure to get your name in by the end of the night, and I'll be getting in touch with all of our winners later this week. And finally, at the beginning of today, I mentioned a couple of upcoming events that we'll be hosting. So in February, we'll be talking about carbon capture and storage, and we'll meet again on World Water Day in March to talk about our fight for water justice. So Kia will reshare the link in the chat where you can sign up for those events. And that's it for tonight. So a little bit later, you'll get an email or text message asking you to submit some feedback about today's event. So please do leave a comment. And then later this week, I will be sending out the recording of tonight's discussion. Feel free to share that with family and friends. And thank you all again so much for being here this evening. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.